Peace be upon you, dear friends. Through hunger there is always fullness. Now imagine this. A cheerful little boy, full of energy and love for play, suddenly collapses in his front yard. His mother breaks into tears, pleading to Allah that her precious child not be a victim of a deadly outbreak. But fate had a different plan. His body froze, his voice vanished, and his breath could only continue through a giant iron tube for 7 long decades. Not to live, but just to survive alone inside a prison of steel. What made him still able to smile and even become a lawyer? But before that, for those of you who are Muslim, I encourage you to write down shalawat upon the Prophet Muhammad, so that this shalawat may bear witness and intercede for us in the hereafter. Liking and subscribing to this channel greatly helps in spreading Islamic dawah and becomes a form of ongoing charity. Assalamu alaikum, dear friends. Through hunger surely comes fullness. Imagine a 6-year-old boy running freely through the yard, laughing with his beloved dog in the warmth of the summer of 1952. But within days that laughter vanished. That small body collapsed, unable to move, unable to breathe, as if his life was slowly but surely being taken away by something invisible, yet deadly. Polio virus came without a sound. Crept into little Paul Alexander's body, swiftly crawling to his spinal cord, paralyzing his nerves one by one. Started with a fever, then weakness, then his breath was gone. His parents panicked and called the village doctor. But the situation kept worsening until Paul's body turned blue from lack of air. He could no longer breathe on his own. Only a faint sound escaped from his weakening throat. In a state of emergency, an ambulance rushed Paul to Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. In the cold emergency room, the doctors saw only one remaining option: to place Paul's body into a large iron tube known as the iron lung. The iron lung, an old machine resembling a steel coffin. Its mechanical hissing sounded like a metallic monster breathing for a human. Paul was slowly inserted into the tube, with only his head visible. And from that moment he began to live not with his own lungs but with the air pressure controlled by that machine. Days passed. Night turned to morning, then noon turned to night again. Paul's body never moved. He lay in the metal cylinder constantly. He could only see the ceiling above and hear the hum of the machine that kept him alive. Every breath was not his own doing, but the result of mechanical labor. His mother's tears never stopped from the first night Paul entered the iron lung. She could only hold his now cold hand, staring into her little boy's eyes that kept pleading as if asking, "Why can't I get out of here?" But there was no answer. Only the hissing sound of the machine that kept pumping air into his lungs. Even the doctors lost hope. "This boy won't last long," one of them told his mother. But a small miracle happened. Paul survived. One day, then 2, then a week, and that machine became the most loyal companion of his life. He learned to sleep, to eat, even to talk, all while lying down without being able to move a single finger. In his mind, Paul often recalled moments before he got sick. The smell of wet earth as he chased a ball, the sound of his father's footsteps coming home from work, and the evening sunlight entering his bedroom window. Now all of that felt like a dream. His new world was narrow, silent, and entirely dependent on a machine. His nights were filled with fear. He feared the power might go out. He feared the machine might fail. He feared he wouldn't be able to breathe. Every night, he prayed in his heart, hoping to see the light of another day. But at 6 years old, he didn't yet understand surrender. He only knew one thing: he wanted to live. But before we continue, for those of you who are Muslims, I invite you to write shalawat upon the Prophet Muhammad, so that this shalawat may become a witness and intercession for us in the afterlife. Liking and subscribing to this channel greatly helps in spreading Islamic dawah and becomes a source of everlasting reward. Life inside the iron lung. The machine growled softly, like a living creature that never slept. Day and night, the iron lung hummed, pulling and pushing air into Paul's body, forcing him to breathe when his lungs could no longer do it on their own. Inside that steel cylinder, Paul's body was tightly enclosed, with only his small head sticking out, resting on a thin pillow, his gaze fixed on the ceiling of the hospital room. He was only 6 years old when the world stopped moving for him. The iron lung wasn't just a breathing aid. It became his home, his bed, his classroom, and one day the place where he would grow old. The machine stretched nearly 2 meters long, with a small glass window on the side to monitor the patient's body. Air was pumped in with negative pressure, forcing his chest to expand so his lungs could take in oxygen. Without that machine, Paul would die in minutes. The first days inside the machine were silent torture. He couldn't move, couldn't turn his head, couldn't even scratch an itch. Imagine a child who used to run and jump, now only able to communicate with his eyes and mouth. There was no place to rebel, no space to hide from fear. The only sounds that accompanied him were the rhythmic thumping of the machine and the whooshing of air pulsing through it. Time passed slowly. Every second felt like an hour. He could hear the laughter of other children in the hospital hallway, the footsteps of nurses going back and forth, and sometimes the cries of other polio patients. But Paul never joined in their laughter. His body was frozen inside the machine. He couldn't even hug his mother. All he could do was look at her with hope every time she approached, then give a faint smile, holding back tears that always threatened to fall. The night was the most silent and agonizing time. When the lights went out and everyone was asleep, Paul stayed awake. He heard every hiss from inside the machine. He knew that if the power failed or the pump stopped for even a moment, that would be the end of his life. That fear became a ghost hiding behind the sound of the machine. But Paul, with all his strength, steeled his heart. He knew there was no turning back. And because of that, he had to keep living even while imprisoned. Slowly, he began to adapt. He learned to speak in short words, though his breath was limited. He learned to read from books placed above his head. Eventually, he began to recognize the different sounds of the machine as markers of time. The device that once seemed terrifying gradually became a faithful companion, a guardian of life that never complained. One day, a young doctor said, "This boy will grow up in this machine." The words left everyone in silence. But Paul didn't cry. He simply looked at the ceiling and said in his heart, "If this is the life Allah gave me, then I will live it." Childhood in the hospital. Rows of iron beds and iron lung machines filled the large room, like a battalion of soldiers who had lost the will to fight. The hospital air felt cold, reeking of antiseptic and fear. In the middle of a sea of children also suffering from polio, little Paul lay in silence, with only his head protruding from the mouth of the metal machine that had become his prison. He was not alone. To his right and left were other children, boys and girls, who shared the same fate. Some were younger than him, others only lasted a few weeks before their bodies gave up. Paul often heard sobs, cries of pain, then silence, followed by the hurried footsteps of nurses carrying a sheet toward one of the beds. After that, the bed would be empty, ready for a new patient the next day. Paul saw for himself how a child who smiled at him just yesterday now lay lifeless. There were moments when he could no longer hold back his emotions. One night, he cried in silence. No sound came out, for his chest couldn't press the sobs like before. He wished everything would end. In a faint, halted prayer, Paul whispered, "Allah, if you want to take me, then take me." But life kept forcing him to hold on. Day by day, his body grew thinner, but his spirit slowly began to strengthen. He learned to observe the world from inside the machine, to study the movements of the nurses, to recognize voices without seeing faces. Sometimes, he could guess who was coming just from the sound of their footsteps. Paul's world was narrow, but his imagination ran wild. Not every day was dark. There was a nurse named Emma, a gentle and patient young woman. Emma loved reading stories to children who couldn't read on their own. Her voice was like music to Paul's ears. Even if only for 5 minutes, those moments became a treasure. Paul began to look forward to the days when Emma would come. He learned to store happiness in its simplest forms, a voice, a smile, even a soft touch on his forehead. Yet the trauma always lingered. Every time someone was wheeled out and never returned, Paul fell silent again, drowning in fear. He began to wonder, would he live like this forever? Or would he soon follow those who left in silence? But Paul didn't die. He kept breathing. He continued living in the rhythm of the machine that never stopped working, as if Allah had not yet given permission for his story to end. Home care and a new spirit. After years of living in a cold hospital filled with loss, Paul was finally sent home. The house that once echoed with laughter had now become a place of cautious care. The living room was transformed into a special room where the iron lung was placed right at the center. His father and mother became untrained nurses, learning from scratch how to keep their child alive inside the confines of a metal tube. The iron lung hummed all day long. Sound became the heartbeat of the house. Every night, his mother slept in a chair beside the machine, holding Paul's hand while whispering prayers. His father worked twice as hard to afford electricity and extra medical supplies, sometimes even sacrificing his own meals so that Paul could survive. Amid that despair came a nurse who changed everything. Her name was Sullivan. Unlike the others, Sullivan didn't just care for Paul's body, she touched his soul. She brought warm smiles, funny stories, and unshakable determination. One day she said, "Paul, if you can learn to breathe on your own, even just a little, I'll give you a special gift." Paul, who at the time could only roll his eyes toward her, asked softly, "What gift?" Sullivan smiled, "A puppy." "You like dogs, don't you?" That promise changed Paul. From a boy on the verge of giving up, he suddenly had a purpose. He wanted that puppy. He wanted to feel the soft cuddle of a little creature that could stay beside him, sleep next to his iron tube. And so began the grueling training. Sullivan taught him the frog breathing technique, using throat muscles to manually pump air into the lungs. Those days were filled with exhausting effort. Sometimes Paul passed out from lack of oxygen, sometimes he could only cry in silence. But he kept trying. Within a week, he managed to take one breath on his own. 2 weeks later, he could go 5 minutes without the machine. That was a miracle for a fully paralyzed boy once sentenced to never breathe without assistance. And then the day arrived. Sullivan walked into the room carrying a small, wiggling box. Inside was a tiny brown puppy who leaped out and licked Paul's chin, still trapped inside the iron lung. Paul laughed, a real, heartfelt laugh, for the first time in so long. The whole house lit up, not because of any lamp, but because of hope. Learning and schooling at home. Days passed beneath the simple roof of the Alexander family home. The iron lung still stood firm in the center of the living room, like a permanent guardian of Paul's life. But now the atmosphere was no longer gloomy. Paul's spirit burned brightly after his success in breathing without the machine, even if only occasionally. He began to look at the outside world with new hope. His parents, despite their many limitations, started planning a future for their son, who had grown into a curious young teenager. Because his body was fully dependent on the machine, Paul couldn't sit in a classroom like other children. So the school came to him. Volunteer teachers came to the house bringing books, chalkboards, and audio cassettes of lessons. Paul began learning math, history, literature, and science, all from inside the metal tube that confined his body. But his mind wandered freely, breaking through the walls of the house and exploring the world through the words he listened to with great enthusiasm. But learning was no easy task for Paul. He couldn't hold a pencil or type with his hands. Yet he didn't give up. With the help of his teacher and nurse, he began using a small stick placed between his teeth. With that tool, he tapped out letter by letter on a typewriter position level with his face. Every letter that appeared on the page was the result of a long struggle between biting, concentration, and persistence. Sometimes he mistyped. Sometimes tears fell from exhaustion. But not once did he stop trying. Besides writing, Paul began to paint. A small canvas was hung in front of him, and with the stick in his mouth, he drew line by line, slowly but surely forming images. He painted skies he couldn't see, fields he couldn't walk on, and the faces of friends he once knew. His paintings were more than just art. They were the expression of a heart that had been silently speaking for so long. Thanks to his spirit and hard work, Paul successfully completed the equivalent of middle and high school education. An extraordinary achievement for someone paralyzed and living full-time inside a metal tube. His graduation certificate was pinned to the wall of the house, right above the iron lung. A symbol of a small victory from the great struggle of a boy who refused to surrender to fate. Inside the quiet hum of that iron machine, his determination continued to live and grow. College and becoming a law student. Paul was never satisfied with just a high school diploma. Beneath his physical limitations, his soul thirsted for knowledge and recognition. He wanted more than just survival. He wanted to live with dignity. And so began a long journey to apply for university. But the responses from various campuses were always the same: rejection. The reasons were predictable: inadequate facilities, complex special needs, and logistical burdens deemed too heavy. Each rejection letter felt like a blow to Paul's heart. But as always, he refused to give up. With the help of his teacher and Nurse Sullivan, he kept submitting application after application. Until finally, Southern Methodist University (SMU) opened its doors. It was here on this campus that Paul's spirit found its place. He didn't arrive with a strong body or confident stride, but with unwavering determination radiating from the breathing machine that always accompanied him. Challenges of campus life were harsher than he had imagined. Paul had to adapt to class schedules, room changes, and academic activities while still depending on respiratory assistance. He used a custom wheelchair fitted with a portable oxygen tank, designed in such a way that he could breathe without the iron lung for limited periods. While other students rushed between classrooms, Paul had to count every second and every liter of air he inhaled. Even so, he never complained. He listened attentively to his lecturers, took notes using a stick in his mouth, and completed exams under conditions that would make most people give up. The bustling classrooms filled with laughter and noise became a silent stage for Paul's quiet struggle. He knew that every day on campus was a battlefield between limitation and willpower. But he also knew that he wasn't fighting just to graduate. He was fighting to change the world's perception of people like him. After some time at SMU, Paul transferred to the University of Texas and chose to study law. Law was no easy path. He had to read thousands of pages, analyze statute after statute, and write sharp legal arguments. But for Paul, this was the path to fight for justice, not just for others but also for himself. 'Cause he knew that his life, full of struggle, was living proof that every human being, no matter how weak their body, has the right to dream big. Graduation and becoming a lawyer. After years of exhausting effort and tears, that day finally arrived. Paul Alexander, a man who had relied on a machine to breathe for nearly his entire life, was about to face the highest test in the field of law, the bar exam. There were no hospital rooms, no whispering nurses, no hissing iron lung around him. There was only himself, a sheet of test questions, and the gentle hum of a portable oxygen tank that accompanied him as he pushed past his limits. He took the exam without the help of the iron lung. A decision that wasn't just bold, it was dangerous. But Paul didn't want a single one of his achievements to be discounted as charity. He wanted the world to know that he passed not out of pity, but because he was capable. With a stick in his mouth and sharp eyes reading each question, Paul calmly faced one complex legal problem after another. Every ticking second wasn't just a countdown to the end of the exam, but a heartbeat of hope on the road to recognition. When the exam results were announced, an overwhelming emptiness filled the room. Torn between fear and surrender, he looked at the results being read out loud for him. Passed. One word that sounded like thunder in a silent sky. Paul was officially a lawyer. At the age of 40, he didn't just earn a degree. He shattered the walls that had long blocked the paths of those deemed imperfect. He had fought through limitation, fear, and even death itself. News of Paul's achievements spread quickly. Amid the chaos of the legal world, his name became a symbol of resilience and courage. He was not just a lawyer. He was a living testament of defiance against a cruel fate. For some, becoming a lawyer is a profession. For Paul, it was a form of retribution against a life that had tried to break him since childhood. But becoming a lawyer was only the beginning of a new chapter in his life. The world now looked at him with eyes full of awe, and Paul knew that the stage of his life was no longer a narrow space inside a metal tube, but a vast stage that would carry him into an even greater story. An inspiring career in law. For nearly 3 decades, Paul Alexander pursued his profession as a lawyer with unshakable integrity. Each day, he wore a crisp suit, his hair neatly combed, and a firm smile on his face. He stood in court not merely as an inspiring figure with a disability, but as a skilled legal expert, respected by both allies and adversaries. Sitting in a specially designed wheelchair, Paul entered courtrooms with an oxygen tank at his side. He didn't seek pitying looks, only respect. Judges who once harbored doubts became admirers. His clients arrived with anxious faces and left with relief, knowing that behind that physically limited body was a sharp mind and a compassionate heart. Paul often handled family law and bankruptcy cases, 2 areas filled with pain and drama. He didn't just represent, he listened, embraced, and comforted. To a mother abandoned without support, Paul offered gentle words. To a father on the verge of losing his home, Paul looked him in the eye and said, "As long as I have breath, we'll find a way." Despite the constant demands of his physical condition, Paul never shirked his professional duties. He drafted documents, wrote legal arguments, and accompanied clients into court. Sometimes, when his breath became labored, he would signal for a brief pause, then continue speaking as if nothing had happened. He turned his weakness into strength, silencing doubt with relentless dedication. Paul's story spread far beyond the courtroom. He became an inspiration to many. Law students often came to him seeking encouragement, eager to learn from his courage and honesty. In front of them, Paul never bragged about his accomplishments. He simply said, "If I can do it, imagine what you can do with a complete body." And there, in that quiet humility, lay the true wonder of Paul's career, not just in the cases he won, but in the fire of hope he passed on without ever raising his voice. Activist and author. Amid his busy career as a lawyer, Paul Alexander never forgot his greater mission, to fight for the rights and dignity of people with disabilities. He knew all too well what it felt like to be trapped by physical limitations, underestimated by the system, and forgotten by society. That's why he raised his voice louder than ever, not through shouting but through writing that stirred the heart. Paul often spoke at advocacy forums both locally and nationally. With a microphone positioned near his lips and his breathing measured through the frog breathing technique he had mastered, he spoke about the importance of accessibility, equal education, and humane healthcare for people with disabilities. His words weren't theory, they were the living testimony of undeniable truth. But the peak of Paul's dedication came when he wrote a deeply moving book, 3 Minutes for a Dog. The title was taken from a pivotal moment in his life, a small promise from Nurse Sullivan that he would be given a puppy if he could learn to breathe on his own for 3 minutes. That tiny challenge became a beacon of hope amid a life that had nearly gone dark. Writing a book while completely dependent on a machine was no easy feat. Paul gripped a stick between his teeth that was connected to a keyboard, typing letter by letter with unwavering patience and undying determination. For years, he poured his story into honest and stirring sentences, until the book was finally complete. It became not just a literary work, but a legacy of life. 3 Minutes for a Dog wasn't just about a little puppy. It was about the power of hope, the sincerity of the people who surrounded him, and the courage to keep living even when everything seemed impossible. The book spread to many countries, read by thousands, and changed the way the world viewed disability. Paul didn't just touch the law, he touched the human heart. Passing and global recognition. On a quiet morning, March 11, 2024, the world was shaken by heartbreaking news that touched everyone who had ever heard Paul Alexander's life story. At the age of 78, the man who had spent over 7 decades living inside a metal tube took his final breath. Not in front of cameras or under the roar of applause, but in solemn silence, as if the whole world bowed its head in remembrance. The iron lung, the massive machine that had served as his lungs for so long, stood as a silent witness to an unending struggle. It did more than help Paul breathe. It became a symbol of strength, perseverance, and the courage of a man who dared to challenge the boundaries of life. While his body had long been paralyzed, his spirit soared far beyond that of the physically able. Didn't take long for the news of his passing to spread across the globe. Condolences and tributes poured in from all walks of life: disability rights activists, public figures, veteran lawyers, and everyday people who had been touched by his story. Many called Paul the true man of iron, not because of the machine that encased him, but because of a soul that could not be broken by anything. The Guinness World Records officially recorded Paul Alexander as the longest living person to use an iron lung, over 70 years. But for many, that achievement wasn't just a number. It was a living symbol of extraordinary resilience and proof that physical limitations could never contain the power of dreams. His grave was filled with flowers and messages of love from those whose lives he had touched. A small inscription was carved into his headstone: "He never stopped breathing for hope." And though his body is now gone, the legacy of his spirit lives on in every breath of struggle he left behind.